Good evening. The Monterey Public Library welcomes you to tonight's program, Monterey County Women Campaigned for Suffrage, presented by Dennis Marr. Since retirement as a computer specialist at the Naval Postgraduate School, Dennis Marr has been involved in local civic and historical activities. He is a docent at the Point Sur Light Station and the Casa Serrano adobe. During election season, he can be seen around town assisting with candidate forums, leading discussions of ballot propositions, and staffing polling places for the League of Women Voters. Dennis, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Monterey County's history. I'd especially like to thank Francesca, who you've just heard, for her incredible patience and in getting me over my technical difficulties. So votes for women. In 2020, we celebrate the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, by which women achieved the right to vote. In fact, on this day in August 26, 1920, the ratification was certified by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby and was officially added to the United States Constitution today. But surprisingly, California women achieved equal suffrage 9 years earlier in 1911 through a state election. So this talk is going to focus on that 1911 victory and the 1896 loss. Women directed the suffrage campaigns. Women were highly organized at the state and local levels. I'll discuss what I've learned about suffrage activities in Monterey County and retrieve a few of the names of local suffrage workers. As Francesca said, my name is Dennis Marr, and I'm the co-director for voter services for the League of Women Voters of Monterey County, who is sponsoring this talk. Now, what was my motivation? Why was I interested in learning more about women's suffrage in Monterey County? Well, it all started from embarrassment. Back in 2011, I was reading the newsletter of the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo, and there was an article in there about the celebration of the 100th anniversary of California women's suffrage. And I was just taken back by that because I knew that the 19th Amendment celebration wasn't going to be until 2020. How did I miss the fact that California women were able to vote 9 years earlier? Well, first of all, it was not mentioned when I took California history in the 4th grade. We just made those salt and flour maps of California, putting in the Sierras and the San Joaquin Valley. I also did not really comprehend how much, or that the fact that the states set voter eligibility. I should have realized this, but somehow it never really made it that impact on me that I realized that just as some states had restricted voting, some states had extended voting, and California was one of them. So here's a brief timeline of the campaign for women's suffrage in the United States. The convenient starting place is Seneca Falls in 1848. Now, we remember Seneca Falls, especially this year, as the starting point for women's suffrage. But in fact, Seneca Falls was a conference about women's rights. They were concerned about things like women being able to keep money that they'd earned rather than having to turn it over to their husbands or a male in their family. They were concerned that women had the right to preach in church, that they had access to the professions such as law or medicine. Suffrage was mentioned, but in fact it was considered very controversial. Lucretia Mott, who was one of the leading abolitionists of that time and went on to become a famous suffrage worker, was concerned that for women to ask for the vote would be considered so ludicrous that people would dismiss all the other demands as being out of hand. So even at the beginning, women's suffrage had a hard start. We go all the way from 1848 through the Civil War, through the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, until 1893, when the first state established equal suffrage for men and women. This was in Wyoming. In 1896, Californian women proposed a suffrage amendment that lost. Now, of course, when we say lost, it means more men voted against it than voted for it, because only men could vote. In 1911, women's suffrage was again on the ballot, and this time it won, but again, only through the thinnest of margins. And then finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. And if you've heard the story about Tennessee, that it squeaked through by a single vote. So even though it took 72 years, I don't know if it could have gone any faster, because every critical vote was just razor thin. So let's start with the election of 1896, the first time that women in California attempt to win the vote through a state election. Now, the really fun thing about the 1896 election, although it was a downer because the amendment failed, was that the most famous suffragist in the United States, Susan B. Anthony, came to California for a number of months and campaigned for this amendment. And in fact, she's going to come to Pacific Grove. Susan B. Anthony at this time was 76 years old. She might look like a statue or somebody who just sits on the porch, but in fact, physically, she was a very active person. And when you look at her schedule, it's just stunning. Now remember, 1896, there were no cars and freeways. You got around by trains, by ferries, or horse-drawn conveyances. And this was her schedule before and after she came to Pacific Grove. It was easy to track her because being one of the best known women in America at that time, all the newspapers were tracking her movement. So the Sunday before, she's in San Francisco talking to the Democratic General Committee. Then on Wednesday, she's speaking to a farmer's school in a camp in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Friday, she gets to Pacific Grove and speaks at the Chautauqua. On Saturday, she's back in Berkeley talking to Republicans. On Sunday, she's back across the bay in San Francisco talking to socialists. And on the 19th, on Monday, she returns. Again, this is all by train and various other slow means to Pacific Grove to speak to, well, what would we say, teetotalers, to people at the Chautauqua. And then on Thursday, she's in Oakland talking to the Salvation Army. So you can see that she had a very full schedule that just went on for months after months. So Susan B. Anthony visits Pacific Grove. Where did she speak? It was to the Chautauqua Literary and Science Circle. This was an assembly that was established in Pacific Grove in 1879. It was modeled after the Chautauqua in New York. It was a 2-week session of courses for education and entertainment. People came from around and stayed for the entire time. Tents were erected on wooden platforms in Pacific Grove, and this is where people stayed. Later, as the city developed, people took these platforms, built houses on top of them, and so that's how in the Pacific Grove retreat area, you get all those charming small houses about the size of a single wide trailer. And here was the announcement in the local paper, School by the Seaside. Chautauquans prepare their program for the Pacific Grove Assembly. The Reverend Anna Shaw and Susan B. Anthony to take prominent part. Anna Shaw was one of the national leaders of the suffrage movement. She was both an ordained minister and a medical doctor. Now, where did Susan B. Anthony speak? If you're familiar with Pacific Grove, you may have heard of Chautauqua Hall. If you've been in Chautauqua Hall, you know it's a large, airy space. Seems it's used for meetings today. But in fact, no, that was far too small. She spoke at the Methodist Episcopal Church and Assembly Hall. This was a church that was on Lighthouse Avenue between 17th and 18th. It was constructed in 1888 and demolished in 1963. When I got to the Monterey Peninsula in 1971, it was just a clear piece of ground which was being used as a community garden. Since then, commercial buildings have been put up on that site. The church and assembly hall were designed specifically to hold very large crowds. The interior walls of the church were movable so that they could create one large space. I have not been able to find any definitive statement of how many people could fit inside. Let's just say hundreds, 500, I have no idea. However, you have to remember also, this is the time before amplification. An orator had to be able to speak loudly and clearly enough to be heard in the back row. And at 76 years old, Susan B. Anthony was able to do that. Here's a report from the paper. It said, the most enthusiastic sessions of the Chautauqua Assembly have been held today. Miss Susan B. Anthony, Miss Shaw, and others. The assembly hall was crowded to the doors at every meeting. And although the crowd was mainly composed of women, there were a goodly scattering of men present. Now, what did she say? Well, the newspaper continues. At 3 o'clock, Miss Susan B. Anthony made an address directing her speech more particularly to the amendment question. She said, "Now is the opportune time to secure our rights, for we will not have another opportunity in the next 30 years. The statement, "Now is the opportune time to secure our rights," is the basis of Susan B. Anthony's concept of why women needed the vote. The early suffragists basically all came from the abolition movement, and they were very attuned to the idea of personal rights and the rights of a citizen. So to them, suffrage was the right of all citizens. A couple decades earlier, to make this point, Susan B. Anthony registered and voted, stating that she was a citizen, and there was nothing in the Constitution that prohibited her from voting. She was trying to generate a test case, and it got a little ways. She was arrested, and she was convicted and in a trial, and she refused to pay the fine, hoping that they could take this case all the way to the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, someone else jumped in, paid the fine, and somebody calmed down the situation. And then in addition to suffrage being the right of all citizens, without suffrage, she felt that women cannot be considered equal. So the 1896 election, what were the results? I already gave it away. The amendment was defeated, 55% to 45% around the state. Monterey County was very similar in those percentages. The largest block of opposition came from San Francisco, which was the leading city at this time, both in population and in wealth, influence, manufacturing, and such, and also the East Bay. The forces who opposed women's suffrage were still around for the 1911 election, so we'll discuss them at that time. So we come to an interim where nationally not much was going on. In California, there was organizing going on in this 1897 to 1910 interim. At this point, let's see, I'd like to talk about this quirky 1874 law. It was passed, and although women could not vote, it allowed women to run for elective offices that had to do with education. And this would be school boards and superintendents of school. So here's the first woman whom I would like to highlight. She's not directly involved in the suffrage narrative, but she's important to the greater political history of Monterey. So the question is, who was the first woman in Monterey County to win elective office, and when did that happen? I was really pleased to resurrect this name. In fact, I got in contact with her descendants, and they did not even know that she had achieved this honor. This was Nellie Chope, and she ran for and won the Monterey County Superintendent of Schools in 1898. Nellie Chope was born in Ohio in 1870. She was a graduate of what was then called California School Normal of San Jose, which we now know as San Jose State. She taught in Salinas during the Salinas Valley in the 1890s, and was principal of the King City High School. Now, at this time in Monterey County, the single room schoolhouses were the norm. And although Nellie Chope was principal of a high school, there were only 2 teachers in that high school, of which she was one of them. On the other hand, it was more money, so I'm sure she was glad she had the job. So in 1898, Nellie Choate, who was only 28 years old, decides to run for political office. I can't confirm it, but I would also guess she was probably the first woman in Monterey County to ever run for a political office. She served, she won, she ran as a Republican because these jobs were still partisan. They were not nonpartisan as they are now. And she served as county superintendent of schools 1898 to 1902. She was well regarded as an educator. In 1901, she was elected president of the Alumni Association of San Jose Normal. Unfortunately for Nellie, she achieves another first. In 1902, she runs for a second term. This time she has to run as a Democrat. It appears that political parties were a little bit fluid back then, people changing parties and such, and there were a lot of different parties too. So she was defeated and thus becomes the first woman ever defeated for re-election in Monterey County. After the election, 1904, her son Harold is born, and she and her husband leave Monterey County. Eventually, they settle in San Jose, where she becomes a longtime principal of the San Jose Evening High School. So that's Nellie Choate. If you're at the Monterey airport, up on the second floor, you'll see this display of women pioneers of Monterey County. And one of my goals is to get Nellie Choate up onto that wall because I think she's an important start to women's participation in the political process. So this time was also spent organizing. Suffragists organized state, county, and city organizations. You'll have to remember this was also the time of a lot of women's groups were organized. And they were not merely social groups, because this was the way that women had to exert influence on the community, is through organized clubs that they could then use to lobby, to raise money for male politicians they backed, to circulate petitions and such. So organizing was not unknown to women, and they just applied it to suffrage. Here, the suffragists stage a parade they're marching to the 1908 Republican State Convention in Oakland. This was considered very radical at the time. Middle-class women appearing on the street, along with the idea of middle-class women speaking to mixed crowds, was considered not part of their social realm. This is a very iconic photo. In fact, 3 recent books about women's suffrage use the same photo on the cover. And it also illustrates that the organizers were very conscious of every detail. For example, that they're very well dressed, they have banners, they are in line, that they are wearing, well, 2 of them are wearing light colors because they photograph better. So this march, which some people consider the first women's march ever. There are going to be more famous and probably more impactful marches in Washington, D.C. and New York City, but they will come later. And I always love this photo because you see that previous one everywhere. And this one, the camera actually caught them marching. Now, why were they marching to the Republican convention? Well, they were trying to influence, among others, this guy, Hiram Johnson. Uh, he, he will go on to become elected governor of California on the progressive Republican ticket, and then become the senator from California until his death in 1945. Hiram Johnson is most associated now with those things that we learn in high school civics, initiative, referendum, and recall. These were all measures that appeared on that 1911 election ballot. Johnson's goal was to break the hold of the Southern Pacific Railroad over the California legislature. You'll remember that SP's nickname was the Octopus. Johnson reluctantly put the women's suffrage amendment on the ballot because he was concerned that it was not going to pass and that its loss would detract from the interest in the other propositions. But in the end, the women prevailed and it appeared in the on the ballot. Now, what was the status of women's suffrage prior to 1911? At this time, only 5 states had full suffrage for women. They were all reasonably small states and all in the West. What about California? California in 1910 at the census had 2.4 million people. Monterey County had 24,000. You can see that Monterey City was the largest city in the county at about 5,000 people, and then Salinas, and followed by Pacific Grove. The county and the state in the next 100 years grew about 16 to 17%. Salinas really grew, 16 or 17 times. Salinas really grew by 40 times, and Pacific Grove and Monterey have had modest increases. So the 1911 election. The 1911 election was a modern media campaign. There was what we would call today a brand. The women's suffrage had their own color schemes, their own typography. They had rallies, newspaper op-eds, graphic arts, billboards, speakers bureau, songs, and plays. Here's an example of one of the famous posters from that era. Posters were put up in the storefronts. This one says, justice for California women, give your girl an equal chance with your boy. Now it looks like this would print nicely on a little handbill or maybe in a newspaper, but in fact, these were printed 8 feet tall. They were posted all over San Francisco just before the election, and the idea was that you should be able to read it a block away. So the suffragists were not shy about advertising. This was another popular method of getting the word out. This was street rallies using an automobile as a speaking platform. And these were not ordinary automobiles. Through their supporters, they would find the biggest, newest, shiniest automobiles and drive those around the state to different locations. A street rally would start with someone playing the trumpet or the trombone to attract attention. Then a hymn might be sung, and then a speaker. You notice that the principal speaker is wearing all white. This is very intentional in that it was felt that white showed up best in the black and white photos of the newspapers of that day. For those of you who are familiar with UC Berkeley, you'll notice in the background that they are parked right in front of Sather Gate, and at that time, Sather Gate was the entrance to the campus. So let's jump down to Monterey, and the activities that you see elsewhere in the state also occurred in Monterey. So here is a report of the first street rally. It was in Salinas, and if you're going to have a street rally in Salinas, where would you have it? Yes, Main and Gavilan streets. The two speakers were from out of town, Mrs. McGrill and Thomas Hayden. The state organization had a speakers bureau, and they would identify people that they considered excellent orators, and they were put on a circuit of locations to go and speak at. Likewise, the posters and op-eds and things like that, many of them were generated at the state level and then propagated to the local organizations. So the state organization really maintained, as they would say today, an on message for the entire campaign. Jumping over to the Monterey Peninsula, here is a report of 3 street meetings where the talk is on suffrage. The speakers were Mrs. Blum, Captain Baldwin, and Ed Berwick. Mrs. Blum and Captain Baldwin were out-of-town speakers, and Ed Berwick was a local. The newspaper reporter says that the 3 meetings were well attended, and at each one of them, an interested audience gathered around the automobile. I think it's similar today. You know, men are just attracted to shiny objects. If you're going to have a street meeting in Pacific Grove, where would you go? Yes, of course, it was at Forest and Lighthouse in Pacific Grove, where it attracted a large crowd. There was a second meeting in New Monterey, but I don't know exactly where that was because it was just reported as in front of the drugstore. So if we had been alive during that time, we would know where that drugstore was, but we don't now. But when they get over to Monterey, where would you have a street rally in Monterey? Yes, Franklin and Alvarado. So in fact, you could go to Franklin and Alvarado today and speak on women's suffrage if you wish. The speakers addressed a couple hundred people, and there was quite a lot of enthusiasm displayed. Now the speakers were Mrs. Blum, who was active in the Oakland Equal Suffrage League, Captain Baldwin. He was actually a polar explorer who had rebranded himself as a professional speaker. And so the suffrage organizers considered him a good enough speaker to speak on suffrage. And then the local fellow, Ed Berwick. Ed Berwick, I was really interested to learn more about him as I was studying his role in women's suffrage. He was a Carmel Valley orchardist. In fact, he pioneered peach orchards in Carmel Valley. He also was very interested and a real backer of women's suffrage. He was the only suffrage leader I could find in the 1811 campaign, who was also active as a leader in the 1896 election. He was one of those county chairmen who took these op-eds that were created by the state suffrage organization and then shopped them around to local newspapers, asking them to print them. In fact, though, he was considered so knowledgeable and such a good writer that the state organizers allowed him to write his own op-eds if he wanted to, and submit those under his own name. So when you look through the archives, you will see letters that are signed by Ed Berwick. Today, there's a park in Pacific Grove, Berwick Park. It's the one with the leaping whales, and it's situated across the street from where Ed Berwick used to live. So their suffrage leaders, nationally and otherwise, have been sometimes characterized as white middle-class women, single or married without children, and well-organized through women's clubs. Was this true also in Pacific Grove? I thought I would look at that question by looking at what I would say would be the 5 top suffrage leaders. Now, the suffrage organization in Monterey was organized initially by state organizers. They came to Monterey, they called for meetings, and at these assemblies, local leaders were elected, so that there was a president and secretary for Monterey County suffrage. There was a president for the Monterey Peninsula, and then a president and secretary for the Salinas organization. So who were these 5 women? Well, the overall president was Mrs. William Waters Jr. And in the style of the newspapers of that time, she's always referred to as Mrs. William Waters Jr. Fortunately, the 1910 census was only a year before, and I was able to recover first names for these women. So she herself was Carrie Waters. She was 70 years old. She had one child who was an adult and no longer living at home, and married to William Waters Jr., who was retired. The secretary of the Monterey County organization was Ida Grant. She was 50 years old. She had been married for 15 years to R.T. Grant, who was considerably older than she was. And so she didn't marry until she was 35, which we think as being a bit older for women at that time. They had no children, and after R.T. Grant died, she became a grammar school teacher. For the Monterey Peninsula president, it was Eva French. She was 57. She had one adopted child at home, married to an attorney. Of the 5, she's the only one that I could find a photo of. And the reason is that in 1922, she became national president of the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. And they had this photo on their website. Over in Salinas, the Salinas Equal Suffrage League was headed by Dr. H.T. Crabtree, and she always went by H.T. It stood for Hezekiah Todd. She was 52 years old, unmarried. She was a graduate of Northwestern University Women's Medical School. It's interesting that a lot of, or not a lot, but more than you expect, women physicians had an active role in both suffrage and in politics in California. And one probably could guess it's because they were highly educated, prominent in their communities, and they had an independent source of income. Hezekiah Todd, I don't know if anyone ever called her that during her lifetime, let's say HT, spent most of her time working in hospitals in Oakland and San Francisco. But for a few years, she was in Salinas in private practice and became very active socially and politically. And for the secretary, we have Anna. Someone who's related to her will have to tell me how to pronounce it, but I'll go with Gail Andresen. She was the daughter of a Salinas attorney, and she was married to an attorney. Jasper Andresen was also the part-time Salinas city attorney. She was 39 years old, and she also had no children. Conclusion from this really small sample is that the leaders of suffrage in Monterey County were women without children at home. They tended to be older, 39, 50, 52, 57, and 70. The household professions were physician, attorney, and teacher. And they also, although I didn't highlight this, they all belonged to various clubs, especially the Salinas Wanderers Study Club, the Eastern Star, Red Cross, and a variety of civic improvement organizations. Now, the suffrage movement was a single issue movement, and there were other women's organizations that also signed on as allies. A lot of the women's clubs didn't come to suffrage until late or at all. But one massive women's organization that came in 1880 was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now we think of them as being prohibitionists against alcohol, but in fact they had a broader set of goals than just that. They were concerned about improving workers' conditions, especially women workers, raising the age of consent, improving public morality, and to that they added suffrage as a means to achieving those goals. The woman who nudged the WCTU towards suffrage was Frances Willard. And before I started watching videos about women's suffrage and reading about it, I had never heard of Frances Willard before. She was national president for almost 20 years. And I heard one historian say that she was the most astute political thinker and organizer in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century. And when you hear somebody say something like that, you go, "Oh, I got to learn more about this person." Now, one of the things that Frances Willard did is she added a second way of looking at why women needed the vote. There's Susan B. Anthony, who said, it's our rights. It's almost like it's inherent in us being citizens and human beings. Frances Willard's concept was this. She said that women are guardians of the home. Now, this played very well because that was the woman's traditional role in society. Where she starts to push it is she then says, the concerns of the community, such as health, education, morals, are an extension of the same concerns as there are at home. Now, up until this time, a lot of people thought that a woman's domain ended at the front door, that it was all inside the house. To step outside the house is to go out onto the street, and that is the man's world. And Frances Willard said, no, no, you step out into the street, it's still your community, it's still part of the home. And then she said, and this is also where she pushed political thought, she said, women need suffrage to safeguard the home and their community, that men could not be counted on to vote in women's interest. This was a little bit radical, but she's taking everybody kind of step by step, and the WCTU followed her. Now, since we're in a county, Monterey, that has within it Pacific Grove, which has the distinction of being the last dry town in California, it is worth looking at the local activities of the WCTU. Here's a report. This was in 1910 of the convention of the local WCTU, in which the same attorney, Thomas E. Hayden from San Francisco, comes down to speak about equal suffrage. Thomas Hayden was president of the San Francisco school board. And during the election, elected president was Mrs. Margaret Coleman of Castroville. And I highlight her here because we will be mentioning her later. And two people from Pacific Grove also fill important leadership positions. So in addition to all the leaders, you have the people who work on the committees, who hand out the handbills, who walk the precincts, who watch the polls, who publish the newsletters and things like that. So fortunately, we're able to pick up some of their names and highlight them. Here's a description of, actually it's a fundraiser for the women's suffrage campaign, and it was hosted by Mrs. William Waters, who was the president of the Monterey County Suffrage Organization. And this is where you would pay an entrance fee that was the fundraiser, and then sit down for an afternoon of cards, of bridge or whist, or a game called 500 that I had never heard of. And in the report about this event, it said that Mrs. William Waters was assisted in receiving by Mrs. C.D. Henry, and that's a name that we'll investigate, and that the committee in charge were Mrs. Pell, Mrs. Waters, Mrs. Yates, and we get down to Mrs. T.A. Work, and that's another number, if you're familiar with Monterey County, that jumps out at you. So these two women, Florence Henry, married to Charles D. Henry, who was a bank official. She was 62 years old. And Mrs. T.A. Work, or Maud Work, married to Thomas Albert. She was on the younger compared to the other women that we've talked about, 37. So who were these suffrage workers who worked in the trenches? Well, Florence Henry turns out to be the mother of Lou Henry, and Lou Henry married Herbert Hoover. So it turns out that the future president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, who in the family was known as Bert, but Herbert Hoover's mother-in-law was a suffragist, and I think that's just wonderful. At this time, Lou Henry and Herbert Hoover were married, and they were out of the country, where Herbert Hoover was making his living as a mining engineer, and Lou Henry's mother and father were living in Monterey. mod work, and TA work. The family has a large footprint on the Monterey Peninsula and in its history. They founded the First National Bank of Monterey. They sold the land to Frank Powers and Frank Diefendorf to develop Carmel, and they sold the land to the federal government that eventually became Fort Ord. So they have a lot of roots, and they built a lot of institutions in Monterey County. So meanwhile, in Salinas, we have a report about a social gala. It was to honor a prominent member of the San Francisco Women's Franchise Club, Lillian Coffin. And it was an event where people came, they heard some speakers and about women's suffrage, and they had some refreshments. Now, Lillian Coffin, you probably didn't realize you have seen her before, because she's the woman on the left leading the 1908 Women's March on the Republican Convention. So you can always say that she was a prominent suffragist at the front of the parade. The article later goes on to state that a pleasing feature of the evening was the refreshments consisting of fruit punch and waffles, which were served by a quintet of pretty young ladies of the coming generation of suffragettes. Of course, they didn't know at that time that thankfully they didn't have to become the next generation of suffragettes, that women's suffrage, at least in California, would be passed at this election. But the list of these ladies included Miss Esther Steinbeck and Miss Beth Steinbeck. So that name, of course, really jumps out at you. And it leads us to the question, was John Steinbeck's mother a suffragist? The two ladies in the article, Esther and Beth, Esther was 19, Beth was 16, John was 9, and his sister Mary was 6. Olive herself was 44 years old. So to answer the question, was Olive Steinbeck a suffragist? I can only say probably. First of all, her two daughters were at that function. Her name was not mentioned as attending the function, but more than likely she was there if her two daughters were there. She was a member of the Salinas Wanderers Study Club, which a lot of suffragists such as H.T. Crabtree belonged to. And later on, Olive becomes involved in local Republican politics. So she was not adverse to the idea of ladies getting involved with politics. But I cannot find any letter or any article that where she says I'm a suffragist or that she's a leader of a suffrage organization. So we will just say for now, probably. Now, what were the arguments for and against women's suffrage? It's hard for us to put ourselves back in that mindset of what it meant to be against women's suffrage. But as you could tell, after 72 years, there were a lot of them. Just as today, the two sides of a proposition get to submit written arguments for and against each proposition. It was like that in the 1911 election. So these are the no on suffrage arguments that were submitted by a state senator. And his arguments listed were that a woman's place is in the home. that traditional view of women. A woman must keep her exalted position. This was the idea that women had special moral authority that would be ruined if they became involved in something as dirty as politics, which was the third statement. And then he points to Colorado, which had passed previously women's suffrage, and states that the increased divorce is destroying the home. It is true that divorces did increase, and that without mothers at home, crime was going to increase. Of course, people today would say, well, without husbands at home, crime might increase. Here is your one of their handbills. It says that a home-loving women do not want the ballot. Of course, this is all going on in the surface, in the background. There's other forces. First of all, there was this social conservatism, but also the liquor industry, which feared the enforcement of temperance if women got the vote. Manufacturers and railroads were concerned that women would push for better working conditions. I always think it interesting that these two industries, their political analysis was not wrong, that women added favor to temperance and improvement of working conditions. The yes on suffrage. This was submitted by a member of the California Assembly. The first argument was that consent to the governed means women and men. This is the Susan B. Anthony argument. And then that the concerns of the community are those of the home, the Francis Willard argument, both appearing. And then he does this funny little comparison where he says, women are morally better people, and his proof is that he looks at the prison population and sees that men outnumber women in California prisons by a ratio of 100 to 1. And here is the poster that says that has a woman holding both a cradle and globe of the world, saying, I can handle both. And the outcome in October 11th, 1911 is that women win the vote. The headline, women will vote. Suffrage has a majority so far of over 2,000. The country did, meaning the rural areas, did the trick, and that's really true. The local returns, it turns out Monterey County was one of 5 counties that turned down women's suffrage, but it was only by 4 votes. Monterey voted against it, 60% to 40%. Pacific Grove, they were real fans, maybe because Susan B. Anthony came to their house, I don't know. But they voted for it 78% in favor. The suffrage vote outside of San Francisco and Oakland was sufficient to overcome an overwhelming number of votes against it in San Francisco, where manufacturing and the liquor industries were particularly strong. The margin was very thin, only 3,587 votes, or as it's usually said, 1 vote per precinct is what swung the election. So what happened next? Well, first, women registered to vote. Here's the 1910 registry, and if we look down 4 places, we see Charles Henry, registered as a Republican, 64 years old, a banker. But in 1912, Florence joins him on the rolls. She's there, fifth one down. Florence Henry. She is identified as a female, housewife, and also a registered Republican. In addition, women voted. This was the first election in Northern California where women had the opportunity to cast a ballot. This photo itself is a staged photo. Three women that you see there are were all active leaders of the suffrage movement in San Francisco. I particularly like the woman on the left, Elizabeth Gerberding. And from the expression on her face, she seems very pleased to be there. They also ran for office. This is in 1914, and here is Margaret Coleman, who we had last seen as president of the Tri-County WCTU, and she decides to run for a statewide office for the California Assembly to represent Monterey County. Until someone finds someone else, I'll go out on a limb and say that Margaret Coleman was the first woman from Monterey County to run for a state level position. In the article, it states that the lady is an active temperance worker, and by reason of her intelligence, energy, and perseverance, she is well adapted to advocate the principles for which she stands. She is not a one-idea woman. Margaret Coleman at this time was 57 years old. She was married to a Presbyterian minister. They lived in Castroville. And unlike all the other suffrage leaders, she fortunately had descendants, or I would not have gotten this photo of her from her great-granddaughter. She had 5 children at the time that she ran, age 13 through 20. Margaret, I thought, acquitted herself quite well. She received 27% of the vote. She had the misfortune of running against a candidate who was so popular that he got the nomination from both the Republican and Democratic parties. However, Margaret did outpoll the socialist. So we've seen a lot of success after the 1911 election in California, and then the 19th Amendment in the year 1920. But suffrage in practice still had a long ways to go. First of all, there were all the Jim Crow state barriers that basically prohibited African Americans of any gender from voting. There were questions about who could be a citizen, let alone vote. In 1911, Native Americans were not citizens and therefore could not vote. And if you were an Asian, and they were specifically talking about Chinese and Japanese, and not born in this country, you could never become a citizen. Especially for African Americans, a lot of these barriers did not start coming down until 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. And of course, today we see examples of voter suppression. So this concludes my talk, and I would like to thank the following people for their assistance, either digging through their old family photos or in discussions about women's suffrage or the general history of Monterey. I'd particularly like to mention the Monterey Library newspaper archive, which is now digitized, and you no longer have to look at it on microfilm. In addition, I used the California Digital newspaper collection, which is a free collection down at UC Riverside, and also a commercial site called newspapers.com. When I started this project in 2011, I did a talk at that time. The only way you could read old newspapers was on microfilm. And I don't know about you, but if you were in a dark room rolling through microfilm, I always get seasick. And it was very slow. I could only cover a couple of months, and the only names I had were Florence Henry and Maud Work. So in the time since then, so much of the old archives, thankfully, has been digitized and is now word searchable. And literally, we're coming into a golden age of research when a lot of things that were very difficult to get to are now a lot easier. But if in addition, let me just throw in a pitch for the League of Women Voters. Carrie Chapman Catt was leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. That organization, along with Alice Paul's National Women's Party, were the ones who really pushed through the 19th Amendment. After the 19th Amendment was passed, Carrie Chapman Catt reorganized her group into the League of Women Voters, and the League is celebrating its centennial this year also. Lastly, if you are a descendant of a suffragist, especially one who may have worked in Monterey County, please contact me, either my post office box, or you can send an email to the League.